Okay, so in this video I'm just going to go over some stuff about Construct, which is a tool to develop video games, HTML5 JavaScript games. So I have a project opened already that I've been developing in the past. I haven't been working on it for a while, so I don't remember a lot of stuff that I've done in here. But basically I'm going to use it just to have an example of various stuff that you can do, and go over some things like the event sheets and layout and why Construct is a good thing to use to develop video games. This video might be a bit long, but hopefully I'll pack in a lot of information, a lot of useful information about Construct, just so that people can understand why it's a good tool to use. Basically, when you open it, you have like these different sections of the program that can be adjusted and unpinned and put onto another monitor, just so that like things aren't as bunched up, and so there's more room. Even so, it's still pretty simple to read and understand, because it puts everything in like a spreadsheet-like structure. So you could basically just read it from left to right, top to bottom, and it's all everything's has their own locations, and so you can get familiar with where things are, so that you could easily just scan through it and click on stuff and add and remove things, move the stuff around. You could click and drag the events. These are all events with conditions on the left side. Here's the player event sheet, which has more events in it. You have like events with conditions, and then the actions on the right side, and sub events, which kind of get nested within the parent events, and you could minimize, expand them, and things are color coded. Like this local variable is green just to make it stand out, and the font gets styled as well for different things like the variable names, and whether something is disabled, it gets crossed out or has like a line strike through it. So like when you edit an event, you could provide different expression values. In this case, it's setting this text object with this value, and this is a variable name here, normal angle, and then a string with a comma, and then tick count, which is a system expression value. And as you can see, this window up here gives you a list of all the different expressions that you could use from the system object. And right here is the tick count. Gives you a little description of what it is. Retrieve the number of ticks elapsed since the start of the application. You have the DT, delta time, FPS, you got all sorts of stuff. And things to do with text, like finding a string of text, returning the first number of characters in string. You got project names, just a whole bunch of different stuff. You got math stuff. Screen size, window size. You got all the global and local variables listed. And if you go into like specific objects, like if I go into the player folder that I created and holds objects related to the player, if I choose one of these, it gives you even more expressions for that specific object type. like the animation in this case, since it's a sprite object. There's different stuff related to sprites, like the opacity, animation name, the frame, and if you have any behaviors attached to the object, in this case there's a chipmunk physics behavior attached to it, which is a third-party physics behavior that I've added. It gives you expressions for those as well. In this case, you get like the contact normal and contact point of collisions and gravity and joints, different types of joints, their properties, stuff like that. If you have like local, if you have an object instance variables, it lists those as well. If I cancel out of here and go into this layout view, here's the player object here. I could just click on it. This is all zoomed out a bit, but on this properties window, it shows all the properties that that object has. In this case, it has all the instance variables here, so you could set them as well, and it tells you what type of object it is, a sprite, and other stuff. Set the angle, opacity, if it's invisible or visible, if it has collisions and things like that, effects, WebGL effects, basically, like you could add different effects and also create your own effects. You could like tint it, you could do all sorts of stuff. Change the brightness, the hue, things like that, make it warp and distort and things. List the behavior as well as properties for the behavior, in this case the physics object. You could set like what type of collision shape it is. In this case with the chipmunk, you have the box, circle, polygon, segment, or no collision shape, collision groups, layers, all sorts of stuff. And over here you have the layers. You could turn them on and off, and there's different properties for those as well. And down here you have the projects window, and it lists all the layouts here, event sheets and objects. You can create folders and put, you know, objects in them. You just have to like click and drag them into the folder to organize stuff. And you can click on them and it'll select all the objects in the layout and also give you properties related to them. And down here you have what else do you have? You have families, which you can like group objects, similar object types together, and then pick them in the event sheet. So you could apply events to all the objects at the same time, and stuff like that. Loop through all the objects by just picking one object type, and you could attach behaviors to the family, and then the behavior will be applied to all the objects in that family. And that's what I do in the case of physics objects. I just have a physics object family, and I put all the objects that I want to have physics applied to it into this family. So I have like I have a grappling hook, and I have a cord object, I have a grappling hook object, I have the player object, all in the physics objects family. And then I have the physics object with the chipmunk behavior, and that gets applied to all those different objects. And then I could click on them and click on each object in the family and set the properties for that physics behavior, so that each object has their own unique settings for the physics. And then what else is there? So let's go back over into the event sheet. Actually, let's run this because I've just been running my mouth, and you might want to actually see what stuff looks like. Oh, actually, I need to close this because I ran this layout, and I need to run it from this menu layout just because how my events are structured. So let's run this. And here, just basic menu. I could set like different buttons, customize my controls and options. And so if I run the layout, it'll load in the objects for that layout. It might run a bit slow because I'm recording at the same time. And in this case, I have procedurally generated terrain that I created using a custom plugin that I programmed myself. And different enemy AI, one flies around and shoots stuff at you, another one kind of jumps at you and attaches as it is right now, and also seems to be shooting stuff at me. I jump on them and could squish them. So you can see here there's like a procedural tree generated, some foliage and stuff like that. Here's another enemy object that kind of walks around and shoots stuff. The grappling hook. I could create mushrooms and jump on them. And swing around on grappling hook, adjust the length of the grappling hook. Let's see if I could get over this cliff. Oh, there we go. So let's try swinging around some more. Okay, so I think I just remembered something else that I implemented, but I can't remember exactly how to show it off. Oh, wait. There we go. Had it so that like one of the abilities in the game was to like change the environment. Like right now it's like a dirt forest type of environment, but I have this effect. There goes an enemy. That if I press a certain key, it changes the environment into a sandy desert scene. So I was going to have like 2 different types of environments, maybe 3. Do I have another one? Yes, I do. There's a snowy environment, and it all has like similar terrain, so you can kind of move through it but see different stuff in each type of environment. It's a pretty cool concept. As you can see, there's different WebGL effects applied, so you can get some cool effects. And again, the video might be lagging a bit because I'm recording at the same time as I'm playing this, and my machine isn't all that powerful. It's actually almost 10 years old, so some of the hardware doesn't really play well with new modern stuff like WebGL. But this would be running a lot quicker if I wasn't recording and if I had better specs. Okay, so I think that's enough showing of this particular game. So let's go back to some of the events. And event sheets and show a little bit of how to work with them. I said before that event sheets are a great way to program because it makes it easy to just create a bunch of different instructions for the game to follow, and it's easy to organize it. It's structured in a very ordered manner so that your eye just needs to trace along the pattern that it creates. You have the conditions to the left, you have the actions to the right, you have them just listed top to bottom. It runs top to bottom. You could drag things around, reposition them. As you can see, when you click, it's highlighted, so there's visual cues. You have little icons to show this player icon of the object, just so that when you're scrolling through, you could see the object and the color it has and be like, yeah, there's the player object. You don't have to, if it's all just a wall of text, like some programming, some game development tools have, where you're just kind of programming a bunch of text or typing a lot of text. You don't have these nice little visual cues like set chipmunk property. Here, he has a little chipmunk icon, and so like you could just scroll through and see that icon and be like, oh, there's some stuff related to the chipmunk behavior. And then if you're wanting to edit something about the chipmunk behavior, you could easily find it just by looking. And there's also other ways of finding stuff, like hit Control F, there's a search thing. You type in what you're searching for and it'll just list all the events related to that has that like keyword in it. And there's other shortcut keys. If I look online at the manual, there's different shortcut keys. So like there's a shortcut key for adding an action or a condition, adding a group and a comment. You just press these keys and it'll speed up your productivity if you get used to using the keys. I don't really use them that much because it's just easy to just click stuff. If you click here, you add another action, it gives you a bunch of objects. So like if I want to apply an action to the player, you just go to the player object and choose an action like set opacity, set it visible or invisible. In this case, let's say invisible. It gives you the options. You just click it and done. There it is. Now it's invisible on start of layout. And right click, it gives you other stuff. You could replace the object here, replace the action, add another one. So like if you could set a bunch of you could select a bunch of objects and then right click, replace that object with another similar object type. So in this case, I go into the enemy folder with the enemy object. It's a similar object with the same physics applied to it, so I could replace it. And there you go. Now the object is now an enemy, and it has all those events applied to the enemy object instead of the player. And I could undo that, redo it. Pretty simple. Okay, so let's here's the grappling hook event sheet. Things could get kind of more involved with the properties of conditions, like the expressions. You could write out a whole bunch of stuff. Like in this case, we're comparing two values, so the first value to compare, you could round the position of in this case the chord sprite, and to get the x position, you could type .x, similar to how JavaScript works, where you have the object's variable after the variable name. And the less than or greater than, which means basically if the rounded x position, the rounded x position does not equal the rounded contact point position of the chord, or the rounded y position does not equal the rounded contact position, the y contact position of the chord. So they're checking the x positions and the y positions. If they don't equal each other for the chord sprite and the chord object, if that's true, equals 1, meaning if all that is true, then, and all these other conditions are true, then these actions get performed. And then it would go to the sub events and check all those. In this case, we have some local variables in the sub nested in this event. And for the local variables, they might be static variables, which means that the value gets remembered from each tick when the game runs. If it's not static, then the variable gets reset to this default initial value every tick, every time the game cycles through the events. Okay, so you have comments here, and here's a sub event with some actions. It's empty, it has no conditions, so it just automatically runs these actions because it doesn't have to check to see if anything's true or false. And then sets the first angle, which is the local variable here, sets first angle to the chord sprite angle. And you might be asking, like, why do that? Why not just use the chord sprite angle below here? Well, it just kind of cleans things up a bit, just so that you're not referencing the chord sprite all the time. You could just apply it to a local variable, kind of similar to how you would program stuff in JavaScript. It's just this is just a visual way to represent all that. And then set another variable to angle of this stuff. And then here we have a tile map object comparing what type of tile it is. In this case, it finds a position, X tile position and the Y tile position based on these values. If it's equals to -1, meaning that there's no tile set there, it's an empty tile, then it's good. Run these events. If there is a tile there, then it wouldn't run these events. And so you have all sorts of stuff. You have groups to basically organize things. You could have a disabled group. In this case, shows it a little grayed out. If you edit it, you could change that. So if it's active on start, then it's automatically enabled when you run the game. If it's not active, then it's automatically disabled when you run the game. And you could add actions that would set the group active or not. In this case, you can just start typing and it gives you a list of all the groups that you have, which is nice. And then type whatever group you want, and then set it to activated, deactivated. You could toggle it, so if it's deactivated currently and you just toggle it, it would change it to activated, and vice versa. So that's good. So like you could put it into a group, all your events into one group, and a bunch of other events into another group, and then disable one one group so that those events don't run and don't make the processor work as much because it's not running through those events. That kind of helps speed up your game in some cases, because you don't want it checking a bunch of stuff that it doesn't need to check in any particular moment if it doesn't need to check those events. So in this case, it'll enable this grapple group when I shoot the grappling hook out. It'll enable this, and then it runs all these events related to the grappling hook, because if I'm not using the grappling hook, it doesn't need to run through these events and check if the grappling hook's doing anything, right? So that's good. And there's also functions. Let's see, there's loops and triggers and stuff like that. Let me see if I could find a function. I think I have some generic dot product function here that you set a return value based on in this case function parameters that are passed through. So like I could type in function and then call expression dot product and then apply a parameter like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, however many parameters it needs, and then it'll return a value. And so like in this case, it'll set the value in this text. It'll set the text to this, it'll have this value of that function call, whatever. It doesn't need a return of value. Well, in this case it does, but if it's in the action, you could just call the function here, call an expression, set return value, stuff like that. Add a parameter, or just call it within an expression like I did before. That way you could just type in all your parameters, or put like an instance value here, like what was that instance variable? I don't know, player grapple, whatever. You get the idea. Okay, so what else? You could invert events, like here we go. It's a good event invert. I don't know, it probably wouldn't make much sense to invert this event, but you could right click, invert. So chord sprite dot count. So the number of chord sprites equals 2. If that's not true because it's inverted, then it would run through. But if it's equal to 2, if I get rid of that inversion, then it runs if it's 2. But that kind of doesn't make sense for this, because I could just do that in the actual condition. Equal, not equal, less than, whatever. But you can do stuff like inverting the conditions. Like, okay, in this case, grappling, if the grappling hook is overlapping the player, there's no condition to check if it's not overlapping the player, so I would just invert this. So now it checks if it's not overlapping the player. But if I return it back to normal, it checks if it is overlapping the player. So you could adjust the condition like that. You could also create OR blocks, which is like if this is true or something else is true, then or something else is true, it'll run the events. You could disable it, enable it again. Replace object, add other stuff. Add an else condition, so like if this is overlapping the player, do this. Else, add an else. If it's not, do some other events. So that's another way to check if it's not overlapping. You could just run this without any events and then put an else, and so like if it's not overlapping, run some other events. That's another way to do it. There's different ways to do the same thing. And okay, so another thing is you could add loops. Like these are system actions that you could do. You got for each ordered, repeat, while, and stuff like that. You could like pick objects, like pick all the enemy objects where the enemy that x position, or enemy, in this case I have a local variable type, equals, I don't know, what's an enemy type that I have? I don't know, a shooter type, I don't know. Enemy type equals shooter, so if I do that, it'll pick all those enemies of that type, and then I could apply actions to only that type of enemy, like enemy, destroy the enemy, destroy. So I destroy all the enemies of that shooter type, assuming there's a type of that. Yeah. So that's another thing, picking objects. If I pick all the enemies types of shooter, I could add a sub event. Doesn't even need to be a sub event, it could just be a condition afterwards. And then I could further filter out the objects, so I could pick the nth instance, like the 0 instance of that object type. Or I could pick a random instance, or just evaluate something else. Or I could check the enemy is visible. If one of these shooter enemies is visible, then apply actions to all the visible shooter enemies. I can put this under here. It doesn't have to be a sub event because it runs things in order. So it'll pick all those and then check for the visible ones, or you could put this above and just check all the visible ones and then pick the shooter enemies out of the visible ones. Stuff like that. And you could also add other stuff, like if it's a shooter, or enemy dot type equals a jumper. So it'll pick shooters and jumpers. Stuff like that. What else is there? Oh yeah, there's also other things, like you could force it to wait a second or a fraction of a second and then do events after it waits. Everything else will continue to run, but it'll just wait and then run whichever events you have afterwards. Like, so if you want it to run these events after it does these events, but wait like a second, you could do that. Or you could like wait for a signal that you pass back, like you just wait for signal, and then it gives you a tag to wait for, like a test. So it waits for the test signal, and then I could have another event somewhere else that creates that signal of test. Okay, so it might not run this signal until certain conditions are true, but in this one might run before that one, and then it does these and waits for that other events to run, and then once those events run, then these events will run. So it's kind of weird, but it's useful in some cases with some more advanced or complicated programming. So let's undo all that. Anyways, okay, so what else is there? Trigger. Oh yeah, trigger once. You could trigger things once. Like in this case, you could add another action system, and then down here somewhere, trigger once. Also, if it's difficult to find stuff, you can just type stuff up here, and as soon as you start typing, it starts filtering out stuff. See, I type TR, and already it's there, so I could just hit enter. There it is. Boom. Trigger once. And then, so if this is true, the first time it's true, it triggers once, and then it doesn't trigger anymore afterwards, which is useful. Unless it changes, if it stops overlapping the player, and then it overlaps again, then it triggers once. So that's cool. So it only will trigger, it only run these events each time, the first time it happens. If that makes sense. There are some cases where this won't work, like in a for each loop, in any kind of loop, because it's supposed to keep looping over and over each tick. So trigger once won't work inside loops, I don't think. But it's useful. What else is there? I guess I could show you loops. You do like for each order, you could like pick an object type. Again, let's choose an enemy. Then the expression enemy type equals shooter. It'll pick all of those, and then you could order them ascending or descending. Oh, actually, I guess it would order the enemies based on this in the value that you provide. That was my mistake. So like if you have like a Y position and you want to loop through all of them based on their Y position, you could do that, or provide some other type of expression to order them. So there's that, and then it just orders them. So then you can apply the action, like in this case, setting the Z position, Z order, move to top, so move to bottom. You can like order them based on their Y position if you want to do some weird type of Z ordering. That's another thing. You could reorder them You can like move them to other objects and put them in front of the object or behind the object. What else is there? You can just have a generic loop. You provide the loop name or no name if it doesn't need one. The start index, the end index, and then you could loop through. Let's see. I keep using the same objects as an example, so whatever. You can set the position based on the loop index. So you have the loop index here, expression value. If it had a name or a tag, you could type that in like that, and then based on which number it's on while it loops, you could apply that to whatever you need, I guess. It'd be better if I had like a specific example to show, but I'm just going over stuff quickly, not very quickly. Another thing is containers. Let's see, containers kind of group objects together so that when you create one object in container, it creates all the other objects that are grouped with it. So like in this case, I have this text object. I could create a container where it I choose another object to put into the container, and then all those, if this text object's created, that other object would also get created. And then when I pick this object in events, it would also pick the other object that is in the container, so that I could apply actions to both objects by just picking one of those objects, if that makes sense. Which just kind of cleans up some of the code a bit, so you don't have to keep picking a bunch of different objects. I'm trying to think of an example of why you would use that. I guess like, okay, in the case of like a player object, you might have like an object representing the collision box, and then have another object that represents the sprite, which has like different animations playing, and you'd put those in like one container, so that you could just pick the player object, and then the player sprite would automatically get picked, and then you would just apply actions to the player sprite and the player object if you wanted. And that just removes some of the extra steps. Like in this case, you wouldn't have to pick the player and then pick the player sprite. In this case, it doesn't really make much sense relative to the player, because in this case there's only one player. But if you had like multiple objects like the enemy, then you could add like enemy sprite to the enemy object. You don't have to do that. Like, let me see. Enemy type. Like, see, in this case, sprite family, if there's a bunch of objects in the sprite family, all of these, as you can see, you have like enemy, frog, what else? Enemy sprite, soldier. These are on the sprite family. And these objects have an instance variable, object UID, which is an ID that I set to the enemy object. So if one of these sprite families, if it's entering the land state, it picks that sprite family object. Okay, so now once it's picked, I could pick an enemy from the enemy object where that sprite family, I could pick an enemy object with a unique ID equal to the sprite family object's instance value that was set somewhere else in the event sheet. So it's doing the same similar thing as like a container object would do, but in this case it's a little bit more complicated because I have other stuff going on in the event sheet. So then I'd end up with just one sprite, one enemy, or actually if there's multiple ones, then multiple would be picked, and then I would just set that sprite animation to landing. I don't know. Wait, why am I? Oh, okay. So this, yeah, it would only apply to the enemies. I guess, yeah, okay. I don't know. I haven't really worked on this in a long time, so I don't really remember too much about it. Let's go into some of the actual file structure stuff. So like if I open up the project folder, there's various files in here, and you got the event sheets and stuff like that. And I have some files open here. Like here we have the project file open. It has all the settings and properties set in here, and the different behaviors that are being used and plugins and things like that, and objects, all different objects. So if I open the player event sheet, it has stuff listed as well. It's XML file. So the structure is just what you would expect from an XML file. And so if we go into the player event sheet and go to the top, you see it's like unstart of layout, layout name does not equal menu, then it runs all these events. So if we look in the file at the first action or first condition, first event, it has those conditions here on start of layout, the system condition, compare two values, and then it has parameters for that comparison. The first value, layout name, second value, the menu string. So if that's true, then it runs the action, and you can see here the first action is related to the chipmunk behavior. Set max speed to the player object, and then the parameter value 125. So if we go back in here, you see that it's right there. and it's all laid out in here. So it says the player type listed here. If you go back into the project file, it has that player listed in here somewhere. Here it is, name player. It's in the object folder, the object type player, that's the name. It has the plugin type, the sprite. It has all the instance values for that, and the type of instance value. It has animation data, player sprite probably has more animation data. All the objects are listed in here, so that in these event sheets they reference the stuff in the other file. It's pretty basic. And then you have like the plugins that you could create. In this case, here's one. Where is it? I created this one, which just adds extra stuff. Like here's an action that sets the left margin of an object, because there wasn't an action that did that. So I could set the margin of an object, or an expression. I could get the left margin value. I could receive it, and then the actual JavaScript code related to different actions and expressions. Here, margin expression, it retrieves the margin value, or the margin of the right side margin, whatever, or the bottom one, whatever. Or I could set it. So you can create your custom plugins and behaviors in JavaScript. In this one I got a parameter of an effect that an object uses, which I basically copied some of the code from the actual runtime stuff, because in construct you could set parameters, and this is the function that it runs when you set a parameter of an effect. It runs this code here, but there wasn't a way to retrieve the parameter of an effect via an expression. So I took this code and basically put into my own plugin where I get the parameter. So it's similar code, just to basically find the value inside the game. Basically, you have to find the value. So I didn't know where to find it, so I looked where they were setting it, basically to figure out where it was being set, and then based on that created my own function to go to that location and get the data back out and just retrieve the value. Okay, so there's that. Okay, so what else is there? There's various stuff you could do more interesting things, like you could set values based on what's the terminology for it? I don't know, but you might be familiar with like this sort of programming thing. You give like a value like 10, like 100 equals basically like a condition. 100 equals enemy x, or if x position is 100. If that's true, you put a question mark thing. Basically, left of the question mark, it checks if that condition is true. If it is, then enemy x plus 10. If it's not true, you put those what's that? My brain's not working right now. Been talking so long. But those two dots, and then another value like enemy minus 10, or enemy angle, enemy x minus 10. Okay, so if the first condition in here is true, and you could have other conditions like if enemy x is 100 or enemy y equals 10. This line here is an or, is for or. If either of those are true, then do this. Otherwise, do this. Like choose between that or this. Anyways, I think you get the idea. But you could do like more complicated things like this just to kind of get more intricate ways of programming stuff. And there's other useful expressions like getting a random value. And when you type stuff out, it gives you, information as to what you need to type, or it gives you suggestions for what to pick when you're typing and things like that. So in this case, it shows you that you have to provide a range and separated by commas, a range of numbers. Oh wait, I don't know, you just provide one number basically, I think. Or if you do a choose, then you could provide different numbers, and it chooses one of those numbers. Stuff like that. You could interpolate values like lerp, provide one value, another value, and then percent between those values. It's like if you wanted to interpolate a position of an object over time, you could do that. What else is there to show? So yeah, I think that basically shows general stuff that you can do. There's like tile map editor down here. You could load tile map data. Oh yeah, animation editor with all the animations with the frames, and you could set where's the image points. You could add image points and collision box. There should be another window with, oh, right here, properties window. So you can set the speed and whether it loops or not, how many times it repeats, if it doesn't loop, where it repeats, where it loops to, whether it goes back and forth. You could also set the frame speed, which is like if you want to delay a frame by a certain amount or speed it up. It's pretty useful properties to set. And you could load in sprite sheets and import frames from a sprite strip or from files and things like that. It's not the most efficient way of editing sprites, because you have to create all these different animations, and if you want to reload them in, it becomes a hassle to do that if you have a bunch of animations. It would be nice if there was like a way to just use sprite sheets, and so you just reload the sprite sheet and stuff. And that would be nicer, but oh well. You know, you could set the certain layout properties. Like if you want to use a grid, you could set the grid and then snap to. You don't have to show the grid, but you could snap to the grid. Show collision polygons. In this case, it shows like a tile map, all the polygons for the tile. You could set specific polygons for each specific tile. If you want a specific shape for one of the tiles in a tile map, you could do that. And there's useful behaviors like platform behavior. If you just want a default generic platformer way of controlling an object, you could do that. You could add a bunch of different object types. And then what's going on? And then add behavior, different types of behaviors. Custom movement, platform movement, bullet, chipmunk, all sorts of stuff. And if you've added third-party objects or behaviors, it'll list those as well. I have a 3D one. I think that goes over most of the stuff. I think like if you have any questions or stuff you want me to go over, I could do that. Just leave it in the comments and I'll get back to you. Hopefully this was useful and has a lot of information. I know it's kind of long, but that's alright.